Good morning, everyone. Welcome to 21st Century Philippines and World Literature. We are now at our week three, and this is a continuation of our literary genres. So, for this week, we are going to define poetry based on their own understanding, and we will also recognize elements of poetry used in every poems we read. We will also identify what types of poetry we are reading or they are reading, and also label the figures of speech used in literary works, especially in a poem. So now, let's proceed to our discussion. For this one, what is poetry? So poetry derived from a Greek word poesis, meaning making or creating. Poetry is as varied as the nature of man, unique in some sense along with man's eccentricities, yet clings if appreciated or if deeply imbibed by the reader. Also, poetry is a kind of language that allows or that says it more intensely than ordinary language does. Apparently, we have to remember five things about poetry. So, what are the five things? We have A, poetry is a concentrated thought. We have B, poetry is a kind of word of music. C, poetry expresses all the senses. D, poetry answers or demands through rhythm. And E, poetry is observation plus imagination. So these are the five things we must remember about poetry. We also have some best definitions of poetry. So according to Hemino Abad, it contends that a poem is a meaningful organization of words. According to T.S. Eliot, he categorized poetry as a fusion of two poles of mind, emotion, and thought. And according to Manuel Viray, he stated that poetry is the union of thoughts and feelings. And as per William Wordsworth, he said that poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings recorded and tranquility. And as per Edgar Allan Poe, he thinks that poetry it is the rhythmic creation of beauty. And as per Percy B. Shelley, she stated that it is the record of the best, happiest moments of the happiest and best minds. And for Jaime G. Ang, possessed that poetry is the essence of the creative imagination of man. Now, I will share you a video that shows about or that explains about the history of poetry, where it began, and how beautiful poetry is.
Poetry is literature that evokes a concentrated imaginative awareness of experience or a specific emotional response through language arranged for its meaning, sound, and rhythm. It is an art form that predates written text. The earliest form of poetry is believed to have been recited or sung, employed as a way of remembering oral history. In poetry, words are strung together to form sounds, images, and ideas. The earliest examples of written literature appear to have originated in ancient Mesopotamia. The Sumerian civilization first developed writing around the 3400 BC, when they began making markings on clay tablets in a script known as cuneiform. By the 3rd millennium BC, Sumerian scribes were also copying down essays, hymns, poetry, and myths. The Epic of Gilgamesh started out as a series of Sumerian poems and tales dating back to the 2100 BC, but the most complete version was written in the 12th century by Babylonians. It is the oldest known piece of poetry in the world and a rich literary text that explores themes of honor, glory, and human mortality. Poetry has been around for almost 4,000 years. Unlike other forms of literature, it is written to share ideas, express emotions, and create imagery. Reading and writing poetry allows one to see into the soul of another person, see what is weighing on their minds and hearts, and open doors for hidden feelings. Poetry can shine a light in the dark hidden corners of the heart and mind, once thought to have permanently closed off to the world. Some of the greatest poets of all time include: Number 1. William Shakespeare. Birthplace, England. Famous poem, Sonnet 18. Shall I compare thee to our summer's day? Number 2. Edgar Allan Poe. Birthplace, Boston. Famous poem, The Raven. Number 3. Robert Frost. Birthplace, San Francisco. Famous poem, The Road Not Taken. Number 4. Oscar Wilde. Birthplace, Dublin, Ireland. Famous poem, A Vision. Number 5. John Keats. Birthplace, London. Famous poem, A Thing of Beauty, Endymion. Number 6. William Wordsworth. Birthplace, Cumberland, England. Famous poem, The Prelude. Number 7. Maya Angelou. Birthplace St. Louis. Famous poem, On the Pulse of Morning. Poetry is important because it helps us understand and appreciate the world around us. Its strength lies in its ability to shed a light upon the world. Without doubt, poetry teaches us to live. It is a bridge and immediate path to being a better person and the change in the world. Poetry remains an important part of art and culture. From the Shakespearean sonnets to Maya Angelou's reflective compositions, poems are long-lived, read, and recited for generations.
So we have seen the history of poetry, all about poetry, origin of poetry, and famous poets and your poem as well. Now let's proceed to our discussion. So for poetry, we have elements, and the elements are we have sense. For sense, we have three elements of poetry. The first element that we have is sense, and sense is revealed through the meaning of words, images, and symbol. So we have diction. Diction is denotative and connotative meaning symbols. We also have image and sense impression. This includes sight, sound, smell, taste, touch, motion, and emotion. And we also have figures of speech. For figures of speech, this is a simile, metaphor, personification, apostrophe, metonymy, synodoche, hyperbole, irony, allusion, antithesis, paradox, litotes, oxymoron, onomatopoeia, and we will later discuss it. Another element of poetry that we have is sound, and sound is the result of a combination of elements. And we have tone color. For tone color, it is the alliteration, assonance, consonance, rhyme, repetition, anaphora. We also have rhythm, and it is the ordered recurrent alteration of strong and weak elements in the flow of the sound and silence, may it be duple, triple, running, or common rhyme. We also have the meter, and um, meter is the stress, duration, or number of syllables per line, fixed metrical pattern, or a verse form. Could be quantitative, syllabic, essential, and essential syllabic. And also we have the rhyme scheme, and this is the formal arrangement of rhymes in stanza or the whole poem. We also have another element of the poetry, which is the structure, and it refers to the arrangement of words and lines that fit together. And it is also the organization of parts to form a group. We have the word order. It is the natural and unnatural arrangement of words. We have ellipsis. It is omitting some words for economy and effect. We have punctuation, and it is the abundance or lack of punctuation marks. And the shape defines the conceptual and visual designs. Usually, it's the jumps, omissions of spaces, capitalization, and lower cases. So these are the elements of poetry. We have three again, once again, sense, sound, and structure. Now we have different types of poetry. We have two types actually. This is narrative and lyric. For narrative, we have an epic. Epic is a long narrative poem of the largest proportions. A tale centering about a hero concerning the beginning, continuance, and the end of events of great significance, may it be war, conquest, strife among men who are in such position and their struggles take on tribal or national significance. One example that we have is Biag ni Lamang. It is an Ilocano epic poem and it is written by Pedro Bucanek. Now we have another type of narrative poetry, and this is metrical romance. Metrical romance is a narrative poem that tells a story of adventure, love, or chivalry. The typical hero is a knight on a quest. So usually, one famous poetry that we have that is under narrative poetry, and it is a type of metrical romance poetry, is the Lancelot of Lake, a Scottish metrical romance. Now, another narrative poetry is the metrical tale, and it is a narrative poem consisting usually of a single series of connective events that are simple idyls or home tales, love tales, tales of supernaturals, or tales written for a strong moral purpose in first form. We have an example, Geoffrey Chaucer's The Canterbury Tales. Another one that we have is ballad, and ballad is the simplest type of narrative poetry. It is a short narrative poem telling a single incident in simple meter and stanzas, and it is intended to be sung. So we have here a simple ballad or a poem, a famous poem actually, Jack and Jill went up the hill to fetch a pail of water, so it is meant to be sung. So another type of narrative poetry is the popular ballad, and it is a ballad of wide workmanship telling some simple instance of adventure, cruelty, passion, or superstition. An incident that shows the primary instincts of man influenced by the restraint of modern civilization. One example that we have is the English and Scottish popular ballads. So, another type of narrative poetry is modern or artistic. So for this one, it is created by a poet imitation of the folk ballad, make use sometimes with considerable freedom or of many of its devices and conventions. So we have here another example of a modern or artistic type of ballad, the broadside ballad in early modern England. And then last type of narrative poetry is the metrical allegory. So for this one, it is an extended narrative that carries a second meaning along with the surface story, things, and actions that are symbolic. So, one type of poetry that is very famous for metrical allegory is The Wizard of Oz. So now we have discussed the narrative poetry. Now let's go on to our another type of poetry, which is lyric poetry. For lyric poetry, we have the ode, and ode is a lyric poem of some length, serious in subject and dignified in style. It is the most majestic of the lyric poems. It is written in a spirit of praise of some person or things. One example is Ode to Aphrodite by Sappho. So we have another type of lyric poetry, which is the elegy, and it is a poem written on the death of a friend to the poet. The ostensible purpose is to praise the friend, but the death prompts the writer to ask so early in life what is the point of living by the end of the poem. However, we can expect that the poet will have come to terms with his script. We have one example, The Lover's Death by Ricardo de Miguelio here in the Philippines. Another one is Oh Captain, My Captain by Walt Whitman. So it is a famous poet. Another lyric poetry that we have is song, and it is a lyric poem in a regular metrical pattern set to music. These have 12 syllables, and usually, if it's a poem that has 12 syllables, is called dodecasyllabic, and and a song is slowly sung to accompaniment or a guitar or bandurria. And one example that we have is Florante and Laura by Francisco Balagtas. We also have here corridos or corridos. These have measures of 8 syllables. So if um, a poem that has 8 syllables is called octosyllabic and recited to a material beat. Another example that we have is Ibong Adarna by Jose de la Cruz or Hoseng Sisi. So usually they have edited this or they have transformed these beautiful writings into a song or corridors. And last type of lyric poetry is sonnet. And sonnet is a lyric poem containing 14 iambic lines and a complicated rhyme. So sonnet is just composed of 14 iambic lines. So take note of that. So we have here an example, Santang Abad by Alfonso P. Santos. So now we have discussed the types of poetry, narrative, and lyric. Let's go on to the literary devices in poetry. Once again, the literary devices in poetry is very important in the elements of poetry because it falls into the sense. So we have here um, figures of speech. And for figures of speech, we have letter A, which is simile. And simile is consists of comparing two things using the words like or as. So if you have seen the word as or like, it is a figure of speech, but it is a simile. So example, your face is as big as a seed, but you do not bear fruit. So you are comparing, or the writer is comparing the face to a big seed, but it does not bear fruit. So he or she, I mean Carlos Bulosan, is comparing two things using the word like or as, and it falls under simile. Another figure of speech that we have is metaphor. So for metaphor, it is direct comparison of two unlike things or ideas, and we are not using the words like or as. So we have here an example, Dear Lord, let thou be the street cleaner whilst I be rent. So it is a prayer by NVM Gonzalez. So you can see he is comparing the street cleaner and himself, and there is no usage of word like as or like. So another figure of speech that we have is personification. And for this one, this gives human traits to inanimate objects or ideas. So example, the bullet said it to the heart, from noon we shall never be part. Lights from Communion by Gerson M. Malinlin. So for this one, you are giving human traits to an object or in order to inanimate objects or ideas. So we could see that the bullet is basically talking and it has a human trait of talking. So another figure of speech that we have is apostrophe, and apostrophe is a direct address to someone absent, dead, or inanimate. So we have here example again. Little Sampaguita with the wandering eye, did a tiny fairy drop you where you lie? Lines from the Sampaguita by Natividad Marquez. We are see that the writer is addressing directly to someone who is inanimate or doesn't exist. Now we have here another one, uh, figure of speech. We have metonymy, synodoche, and hyperbole. For metonymy, it substitutes a word that closely relates to a person or a thing. Example, the pen is mightier than the sword. He lives through the bottle. I have read all of Shakespeare. By the sweat of our brow you will earn your food. So it substitutes a word that closely relates to a person or a thing. The pen is mightier than sword. So it's for metonymy, it is like comparing, but there is a substitution of word that closely related to a person or a thing. Another example that we have for figures of speech, another type of figure of speech that we have is the synodoj, and it uses a part to represent the whole. So we have here an example: no busy hand provoke a tear, no roving foot shall crush the here. Usually for synodoj, you are using just a part to represent the whole. So we have here, we are using a part um, of our body as to represent the whole poem. So busy hand and no roving foot. We have here another. So these are parts of the body, but it represents a whole, like the tear and no roving foot shall crush the heel. So another figure of speech that we have is hyperbole, and it makes use of exaggeration. So usually for hyperbole, if you see some exaggeration in the written lines, so this is a figure of speech of hyperbole. So example that we have is, I know not what to name thy charms. Thou art half human, half divine, and if you could not hold thee in my arms, I know both heaven and earth were mine. So there is an exaggeration because he or the writer is claiming that heaven and earth could be his. So these are lines from the Rural Maid by Fernando M. Marama. Another types of figures of speech, we have irony, allusion, and antithesis. For irony, it says the opposite of what it is meant. So we have know how to be, we know the word ironic and ironically. So typically, if you have seen something that it is opposite or ironic in the sentence or the written line, so it is a irony figure of speech. So example, I follow these men whose heads are with the stars, who dream unceasingly of blazing royalty. Will only strive to be like you, a dweller of the sod with a heart of loyalty. So these lines are from To a Dog by Floricel Diaz. So another figure of speech that we have is allusion, and it refers to any literary, biblical, historical, mythological, scientific event, character, or place. So if you've seen some of these symbols, such as character of place, scientific event, mythological, historical, biblical, literary, etc., this is a type of figures of allusion, figures of speech. So example, the pendulum is a thing or thread. To a nervous person like me, it reminds one of swaying Iscariot suspended from a tree. So in the line here, the writer had mentioned Judas Iscariot, and it refers from a biblical character. These are lines from After Palanan by Rene A. into Ralde. Another type of figure of speech that we have is antithesis, and it involves a contrast of words or ideas. So there is a contrast of words and ideas. We have here, love is short, forgetting is so long. You may be true in the past, but the past isn't true with you. Man proposes, God disposes. They promised freedom and provided slavery. So there is a contrast of words or ideas in the lines. Next that we have is paradox, and it uses a phrase or statement that on surface seems contradictory
but make some kind of emotional sense. So, example that we have is, my dear canst also resolve me, this paradox of love concerning thee, mine eyes when open with thy beautifully fill, but with the close they see thee better still. So there is a contradicting phrase or statement in the last two lines, because if the writer's eyes were open, it is filled with beauty, but when they are closed, the more he or she or the writer can see whatever that, or better see what's going on, or the beauty of the particular subject that the writer is talking about. So these are lines from Paradox by A.E. Lityatko. Another figures of speech is litotes, and litotes makes a deliberate understatement used to affirm by negating its opposite. So usually for this one, um it it affirms by negating its opposite. So let's check our example. War is not healthy for children and other living things. So this is an understatement. We have seen a negative word war, and it is um, the war used here in the line is telling that it is not healthy for children and other living things. So it is opposite of the meaning of war, meaning supposed to be, if you have seen the word war, it means like there's suffering and pain. But here you are saying that war is not healthy for children and other living things. So this line makes a figure of speech of littles. And last figures of speech that we have is oxymoron, and it puts together in one statement two contradictory terms. We have examples: resident alien, silent scream, and then living dead, clearly misunderstood. So usually, one in one statement there are two contradictory terms. So living and dead, and then silent and scream. So as you can see, they are in the opposite terms or contradictory terms. So if you see those lines, this falls under oxymoron. So for this lesson, we have references. We have 21st Century Philippine and World Literatures by Mindshapers Ko from Recollectos, Manila by Ang Haimechi. We also have 21st Century from Literature from the Philippines and the World, first edition from Rex Bookstore from Recto Avenue, Manila, written by Marikitara Uichoko. So these are our references. And I will also post or send the link of the video that I have shown you about the history of poem and poetry. So for our activities for this week, we have two activities. Activity 1, analogy, and activity 2, identification. Essay. But I will just only require you to submit activity 1, which is analogy, and the instruction is the analogies below are word problems that consist of two word pairs. So look at the first pair and decide how the two words relate to each other. Then fill in the blank of the second pair with its proper pair. So that is the instruction for activity 1, total only of 10 items. So once again, um, we had defined poetry based on their own understanding. We had recognized elements of poetry used in every poem. We have read and identify what types of poetry, and also labels the figures of speech used in literary works, especially in a poem. So I would like to say thank you and share a Bible verse from the book of Mark, chapter 9, verse 23. Said Jesus, everything is possible for one who believes. Thank you once again and have faith.